very much for the kind introduction. I think the slides are with the organization to share. If we could have the first slide, please. So first of all, let me thank the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance for the kind invitation and to say that the three mottos that we see there, innovation, quality, and global reach, are completely in accordance with the main objectives of the work that we perform at WHO. In our department, that I will show you what is our current operation, we look very kindly for the global regulatory reliance and convergence that can be only possible if all stakeholders are involved in a common objective. And that means not only regulators and manufacturers, but also the scientific ecosystem for the development of new technologies for manufacturing, but also for new products. Also to say that in the work that we do, it's very important to keep present the need to improve access to affordable and quality assured medical products. The challenge that I was given was to talk about the future of pharmaceutical operations and quality. And because I'm here representing the regulatory stream from WHO, I picked this topic, regulatory reliance and convergence, as the main critical factor to be understood for the future. We have to remember that WHO, before this current public health crisis, we had already started a global plan of work, the GPW 13, for the years of 2019-23. So when the SARS-CoV-2 impacted our operations and our everyday life, we were only on the first year of implementation of that global plan of work. That global plan of work means that we want to reach, during its implementation, to 1 billion more people benefiting from universal health care, 1 billion more people enjoying health and wellness, and 1 billion more people being protected from health emergencies. Next slide, please. As we move on, we need, if I can have the next slide, as we move on, we need also to be very clear that the current pandemic is not over. And we see here the figures related really to the current data in terms of what we want to do with the vaccination campaign. And you know that the current objective defined by the Director General of WHO in agreement with the stakeholders that are assembled around WHO at the ACT Accelerator, and particularly on the vaccine side on the COVAX pillar, we are aiming to have 70% of the population in each country vaccinated by the end of the current semester. We missed the previous target of 40% by the end of December 2021 in half of the member states of WHO. We have lessons learned from last year, even though I have to say that on the positive side, we can see the huge effort coming from the manufacturing sector, and 2021 saw for the first time a doubling in the global capacity of production of vaccines, with a huge response coming from the manufacturing sector to help to sustain the current pandemic, and also allowing us then to reach a number of stakeholders that could eventually facilitate the allocation and then the distribution of those vaccines. Unfortunately, on the equity of distribution of those vaccines, we have a problem, and a persistent problem that continues. And you know from recent weeks and all the efforts that our Director General is doing with several partners in order to replenish with funds the financial supporting structure for fighting COVID-19, but also to make more operational the deployment and also the absorption capacity of vaccines in specific countries to meet the targets by the end of June. Next slide, please. I'll go fast on the next slides because they are really looking at this inequity issue, the heterogeneity in the numbers when you look for different regions. Next slide, please. And this is also, so we have 27 WHO member states that have still vaccinated less than 10% of their population, and 78 less than 40% as February 17. Remember that those numbers were more than 90 member states missing the target by the end of 2021. Next slide, please. But we have also to say On the next slide, please. We have also to say that COVAX accounts for 68% of the total number of doses delivered in Africa. So just to remember the triple billion objectives, here we see the triple billion objectives that are referred, and our global plan of work is inserted in these objectives with specific targets to be met. So this was designed in 2018 to be implemented from 2019-2023 before we had the pandemic. But let me say also that in terms of some of the tools that we used since the beginning of this crisis, that they were started to be designed before the current crisis, and they are the consequence of lessons learned, for example, on H1N1, but also in the Ebola crisis, and the emergency use listing procedure was established as a consequence of that. Next slide, please. So in our mission, this end-to-end cycle that was pre-existing to the current crisis, it's very important to understand by all. Next slide, please. And a reminder of the regulatory activities that inside this WHO triple billion objectives and implementation of the Global Program of Work 13, we have been deploying. So technical standards and specifications, mostly in the health policies and systems department inside our division, and the pre-qualification, regulation and safety. And I have to say, local production assistance that was not contemplated on GPW 13, but it's now part of our department. Those three pillars, pre-qualification, regulation and safety, and local production and assistance inside the regulation and pre-qualification department. Next slide, please. So this is the structure for our division that is managed by Assistant Director General Mariangela Simão, our sister department, Health Products Policy and Standards, directed by Clive Andari, and I have the responsibility to coordinate the regulation and pre-qualification department with those three units that we have already discussed. But more important than that, with 13 teams, that 155 people working in those 13 teams every day deploy and support member states, national regulatory authorities, and the manufacturing ecosystems all over the world. Next slide, please. So the basic strategy in terms of our department is the coordinated implementation of those three streams of work, with the major target being the access to medicines, vaccines, and other health products and technologies. To do so, we have a different number of organizational structures and functions. I'm not going to go into the detail. Next slide, please. What is important to understand by all is that before we started this crisis, we had already well established the WHO pre-qualification program on diagnostics since 2010, on medicine since 2001, on vaccines since 1987, and on vector control products since 2017. And in order to support that, we have a number of streams of work inside those teams that you have seen previously on the pre-qualification unit, and we are preparing now a team on medical devices, looking at specific medical devices that are needed for existing programs inside WHO, and so also needs that are made aware to us not only by global stakeholders like the Global Fund or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or UNITAID or UNICEF, but also by specific WHO programs like the non-communicable diseases, like the HIV, malaria, tuberculosis programs, and others. Next slide, please. So in order to align activities for COVID-19 vaccines, we had developed a procedure that was the result of the work done after the Ebola crisis, mostly, that was already in place. I don't have time to go into further detail. These slides will be available on a PDF format through the organization for all those that would like to review them afterwards. And if not, you can contact directly our services in Geneva. So next slide, please. So in our four strategic priorities, one very important that sometimes is not referred is this strategic priority to improve regulatory preparedness for public health emergencies. This is very important because as we speak now, we have a number of fragilities on national regulatory authorities all over the world that can only be met through an intense work of cooperation between the three levels of the WHO, so HQ, the regional offices, and the WRs at the country level, but also in a close interaction with national regulatory authorities and the manufacturing ecosystems. We have an issue in terms of deploying our structure in the ground, and this is a meeting from a private sector, mostly a private sector organization. And I have to say that, for example, in order to assist companies and manufacturers that want to prepare a submission for pre-qualification or emergency use listing, we cannot put the pre-qualification directly supporting and assisting specific companies because pre-qualification will be involved in the decision-making process for the approval or pre-qualification on emergency use list. And that's why we established that third unit, which is local production and assistance, that is a growing unit. And there are several missions, including technical assistance for pre-qualification. So those manufacturers that are deeply interested in support from our department in specific files for specific companies should address us through directly my office or through the unit of local production and assistance that is directed by G Suite Doc. Next slide, please. So during the current emergency, we have done work in two different fronts, and this is important to understand for the conclusion that I want to make in terms of lessons learned to the future and the future outside of the current emergency. The first level of work is being, I would say, the external work, the work that we do every day with International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, ICMRA, the work that we do co-sharing with CEPI, the COVAX Regulatory Advisory Group, where a selected number of regulators, including DGCI, since mid last year, participate actively in discussing regulatory barriers and regulatory issues pertaining to the clinical development, pertaining to the manufacturing with specific technologies. All those questions are discussed using Chatham House rules, so those discussions are not public, but an informal and very important forum, the Regulatory Advisory Group inside COVAX, where most of the time regulators reach some consensus that then is being brought to the ICMRA discussions and also to the decisions by individual regulatory authorities. And also a third stream, very important to bring mostly on clinical development, but also on preclinical development, new technologies to fight COVID-19. Not only on vaccines, but also on therapeutics and on diagnostics, the R&D blueprint. The R&D blueprint, which is also coming out of the Ebola crisis a couple of years ago, has been very intensive. So our department and our different teams have been participating during this crisis. When you receive the PDF, you'll see that you have hyperlinks on those boxes to see the individual documents pertaining to the decisions, the meetings, and the forum that were held on those specific timelines. Next slide, please. And then the internal work. And the internal work pertains to two main streams here. The stream that you have, the boxes with the outline in blue, and the lettering in black, pertain mostly, so mostly on the bottom of the figure, pertain mostly to guidance documents that were issued during this crisis in response to the needs to prepare for the development of new products. This was done, of course, in close collaboration with the three different streams that I've mentioned on the previous slide. And then the more operational implementation work, which is the boxes with the outline in red and the lettering in red, also with the hyperlinks there, which pertain to the emergency use listing authorizations, in this case for COVID-19 vaccines. And we have, as of today, 10 COVID-19 vaccines listed for the emergency use listing with 26 drug substance and 42 drug product manufacturing sites that were evaluated, more than 170 post-EUL changes, a total of 470 emergency use listing dossiers shared with more than 100 national regulatory authorities, and we have assisted over 3,270 regulatory authorizations issued by more than 150 low and medium income countries, directly assisted by our department at WHO. These numbers compare with less than 20 products approved on the collaborative regulatory procedure of WHO on vaccines on the 3 years before the pandemic. So the 3 years before the pandemic, CRP for vaccines, we had less than 20 vaccines and approved 20 procedures through the CRP. And in 1 year with COVID-19 vaccines, we had more than 3,000 regulatory authorizations with the complexity of numbers that you see on the slide. Next slide, please. So on diagnostics, the numbers are different, of course, just to say that 15 days after the declaration of the current emergency, public health emergency, we had the first approval for the first in vitro diagnostic. That was possible because the UL system was already in place, but we are facing on this area a huge problem with the quality of the files that are submitted, because a number of manufacturers that decided to come in this area never had experience before. So we are dealing with the quality of the files, with the lack of resources, not only at WHO, but also at national regulatory authorities. And currently we are implementing a task force operation supported by extra 12 experts from 6 regulatory authorities. But just to share with you that when we reach 12 major regulatory authorities, only half of those were able to support us with additional staff, because everybody in the world is overwhelmed with the flow of submissions in this stream. Next slide, please. So also on therapeutics, as you know, a lot of work has been done, a lot of enthusiasm in the end of 2021 and the beginning of this year with the new antivirals. This is work on progress. As you know, also the last 11th of February, we pre-qualified tocilizumab for COVID-19, one IL-6 inhibitor, and we are looking now for the procedures with molnupiravir, with already 4 applications for API under current assessment, and also with the discussions going on the niraparib and ritonavir formulation. Next slide, please. I'm reaching the timeline, I think. So I'll go quick on this one. This is an overview what I referred in terms of the ULs, 4 major technological platforms. We are seeing coming out right now an important number of submissions with protein subunits. Even today, we had a meeting with a manufacturer that is on the final stages of development of another protein subunit vaccine for COVID-19. Next slide, please. This is the map of the authorizations that I referred before per vaccines, and the authorizations there, the different manufacturers also per vaccine. Next slide, please. So we are doing this, implementing the strategy. I will have to go faster. Next slide. If you could move the slide. So we have been cooperating with the national regulatory authorities to implement also an improvement of their regulatory status according to a WHO tool, which is the global benchmarking tool. We do this in collaboration with NRH. We have established in 2021 the coalition of interested partners also to support that. Next slide, please. And WHO recommended regulatory functions are based on a product life cycle, and these pertain to the entire life cycle of the products, looking to the major regulatory functions one by one and in a composite way. Next slide, please. Is a risk-based approach, of course. Next slide. So we have done this work. This is cumulative numbers up to end of 2021. 86 countries were directly involved in discussions or evaluation using the global benchmarking tool and WHO. Next slide, please. The numbers are not the ones that we would like to have. We have only 54 countries with a functional status, ML3 or ML4. We have still a lot of work to do with the number of countries to move them from ML1, where it's still about 100 countries globally, or ML2 to move them to functional status, or ML3. Next slide, please. And we are doing that not only using the benchmarking, but also improving capacity building, cooperation with the specific national regulatory authorities and member states, but also promoting smart regulation. And smart regulation and the principles of good governance for reliance and convergence have been critically developed during this current crisis, and they are being proven in the interaction with the national regulatory authorities in the last 6 months of 2021 and already 2022 to be critical enablers to speed up the process of global benchmarking tool. Next slide, please. We have currently teams in one major country doing the final assessments, and I can share with you, without sharing the name of those countries, that during the first semester of 2022, we have more than 20 countries involved in the either assisted self-benchmarking or formal benchmarking or re-benchmarking to establish their regulatory status. We are going to announce by the end of next month a major step forward, which is the start of the WHO listed authorities framework. The operational guidance document was under public consultation on the second half of last year. We are finalizing next week the consultations with involved NRAs. We are expecting to have 56 NRAs from 54 different countries that will be participating on the transitional arrangements for WHO listed authorities framework, and then compliance framework assessment that will need to be established. And generally, it will be placed between ML3 and ML4, will be reached by those regulatory agencies in the next 5 years in order to have the final stage of WHO listed authorities framework attained by those 56 regulatory authorities by 31st March 2027. So this is ongoing and in process. We are also going to announce in April major initiatives on global regulatory training together with WHO Academy, but it's still work in progress. So next slide, please. So COVID has provided important lessons in the regulatory field overall. I think that most important for the future is to further elaborate cooperative and flexible approaches. The report that WHO and Health Canada coordinated for ICMRA on regulatory agilities is an example of the targets that are established for common cooperation between regulators into the future. And this is important for manufacturers to be alerted to that. And finally, the regulatory challenges that we are facing at the same time that we have still an important number of vaccines and medicines being developed for COVID-19. The need to implement standardized methodologies at the same time we do the regulatory alignment. It's been a critical process between the R&D blueprint, the ICMA, and the regulatory advisory group at COVAX. Next slide, please. So almost to finalize, to say that this is still work in progress in terms of the EUL and the new technologies. You have there a list of the major vaccines that are currently already being discussed with the EUL team at WHO. Next slide, please. And the challenges that we are facing right now with the variants of concern. As you know, one of the major discussions that the regulatory authorities are having right now is what will be the framework for clinical development for vaccines specific for certain variants of concern, not only Omicron, but potentially other variants of concern that will come in the future. And as you know, inside WHO, we have established two technical advisory groups, one on virus evolution and another one on composition of vaccines. Our department supports as a secretariat with other departments inside WHO, the TAC-COVAC on the composition of vaccines. The committee will meet for the first time face-to-face next week. It's been meeting virtually since its establishment last year. But we are reaching a point of decision on new guidance documents in this framework, and you'll have news from WHO in the coming weeks on that side. Thank you very much. Next slide. And just a concluding side with a message from our side. I'm sorry for being so long, but I needed to deliver the entire message to you. And I think that the most important part of the message is this working together on the final slide. What we have done together with national regulatory authorities and ICMA and COVAX RAG and R&D Blueprint during this crisis was only possible because we have worked together. And probably one of the major takes from this crisis is the level of integration and cooperative work between regulatory authorities that has no parallel in history before this crisis. So what we hope to do is, as we will get out of this crisis at some moment in time, not immediately, we'll be able to transport those regulatory agilities in common procedures to be used by default by the regulatory agencies into the future. And we, of course, need to do an intensive work with our colleagues from the manufacturing sector in order to be not only transparent, but also to co-design with them new innovative processes in the regulatory streams. Thank you very much. Sorry for being so long. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but I leave to the share the direction of the work. Thank you very much.